I'm Andrew Nicholls. This is my artwork, which is part of the Dobell Drawing Prize. It's called The Expulsion, and it's my interpretation of Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden, which is obviously a biblical episode that has been the subject of multiple interpretations by artists throughout the last 1500 years or so of Western history. It is a subject that I'd been interested in for some time because in my practice I like to look at historical aesthetic traditions and create my own contemporary versions of them. And I also, a lot of my work is portraiture based, and I create portraits of the men in my life primarily, occasionally female or non-gender specific friends, but most of my portraits are of men who I know, who are close to me, and in this case I have three of my friends as Adam and Eve respectively, and the Archangel Uriel, who in Christian tradition is the archangel who was assigned the task of banishing them from the garden and then guarding the gateway with a flaming sword. And yeah, these are the types of works that I like to create that look at the art canon and different historical, artistic and aesthetic legacies and kind of try and tease out the power play that underpin them. So religious art is something that I've returned to a lot throughout my career. I was raised as a very strict Catholic and have always been really fascinated by Catholic pageantry and the symbolism and the type of artistic outcomes that the Catholic Church has created, again, over the course of the last couple of thousand years of history. And obviously there's a very obvious reading in this work in that it depicts the first couple being expelled from God's grace, and I'm reinterpreting them as a same-sex attracted couple, which is kind of, I mean, obviously as a queer person who is raised Catholic, that's a really important part of the work. But for me, the really important aspect of it is the eclipse, which you can kind of see behind them there, or my interpretation of an eclipse. It turns out eclipses are super hard to draw. And these works formed part of a much larger body of work that I created over the past couple of years, exploring eclipses and how historically they've been viewed by pretty much every culture on the face of the earth as portents of ill, they're sort of bad omens and signifying that there's some kind of calamity going to happen. And so when I was researching eclipses, I found note that there have been Abrahamic scholars who have speculated that an eclipse would have taken place as Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden. Even though that's not actually mentioned in the Bible, the thinking behind it is that, well, it's sort of based on the two eclipses that are mentioned in the Bible, one of which happens when Christ dies on the cross and the sun turns black and the veil of the temple is rent in two. And then in the book of Revelation, it talks about the sun turning as red as blood. So the thinking behind that is that eclipses as portents of ill fortune must have occurred at the three kind of key moments of humankind's spiritual progression: the fall from grace and the banishment, the redemption through Christ's death, and then at the end of days, signifying that those who've kind of adhered to the Christian message will be saved and those who haven't won't be. So immediately that gave me, I was excited to kind of create this work that had been in my head for a while, depicting this biblical episode. And the backstory to this whole broader body of work goes back to 2017 when I was undertaking a residency in New York with an organisation called Residency Unlimited, who are based in Brooklyn, and they host artists from all over the world. And I was there in the summer, the Northern Hemisphere summer of 2017, and in August 2017, an eclipse, a full total solar eclipse, took place above the US. And what was kind of remarkable about that is, I mean, eclipses take place all the time. There are at least 2, sometimes as many as 5 a year, partial and total solar eclipses, and they always have a lunar eclipse that follows them. But more often than not, they happen somewhere that's hard to get to. So they might be in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or in the Arctic, or they're in a part of the world that is in the middle of wintertime and has cloud cover. The 2017 eclipse was kind of remarkable in that it was the middle of summer, so there were clear skies, and it crossed right through the middle of the US. So I think it crossed 14 or 16 different states, which meant that literally millions of people could be in the path of totality and experience the full darkness of the sun turning black and day turning to night. And stupidly, I didn't fly down south to see it happen because at that stage I was not overly interested in eclipses or astrology or magic or all of the things that are the focus of my work now. So I chose to watch it from a cemetery in Brooklyn, the big cemetery in the southern part of Brooklyn near Park Slope, Green Hill Park Cemetery, something like that. And it's a very beautiful, sprawling, high Victorian cemetery with very ornate mausoleums and graves. And about a third of the sun disappeared from where I was in New York. So it was very eerie and spooky and atmospheric, and the sky, the light turned that really creepy, sickly yellow and the shadows disappeared, and it felt very gothic and appropriate. But a good friend of mine from New York, he and his husband and some friends flew down to Tennessee and experienced the totality. And he came back and said, oh my God, it was life-changing. It's the best thing I've ever done. It was so profound. And so I was really annoyed at myself for not actually making the effort to do it. And it immediately went on my bucket list to experience a total solar eclipse. So then, cutting to 2.5 years later, March 2020, the COVID lockdowns had just begun, and I was at home in Perth and got myself in an absolute fury, thinking, that's it, it's never going to happen, I'm never going to see it, none of us are ever setting foot on a plane again, we're never travelling, and the world is ending, and I'll never see one. And I, in this kind of rage, went online and Googled upcoming total solar eclipses, and the first thing that came up was Exmouth, Western Australia, 2023. And I was elated, and I thought, I'm actually going to see one. Even if I have to walk there, I can see one, because Exmouth is about 1,000 kilometres north of Perth, and I don't drive. But I was like, that's fine. I will leave 6 months earlier and make my way through a post-apocalyptic wasteland that is inevitably going to happen, exists by 2023. But as it happened, it was fine, and really dear friends of mine flew from the Netherlands, and we hired a camper van and made a 2-week road trip odyssey out of it. But even then, it was a stressful experience, because the minute I found out it was happening, in 20th of March 2023, so this is 3 years prior to that, I started calling Exmouth, because it's quite a tiny town. I think there's about 5,000 residents, so there are about 10 accommodation providers. And I called every one of them, trying to see if they would let me book something then and there, and nothing was available. And the first woman I called just laughed at me and said, no, bless you, but everything we've got was booked out 2 years ago by NASA. Because eclipses, as it turns out, people follow them because there's huge amounts of research you can do during an eclipse. And one of the many things that makes Exmouth a strange and fascinating and quite peculiar place is that there's a US Army base there, which ended up being in the path of totality. The eclipse passed directly overhead. Hence, through a friend of a friend, about 18 months later, I managed to book a berth at a caravan park, and then these friends and I hired a camper van and went on this trip, and it was incredible, and the whole trip was amazing, but the actual day of the eclipse was extraordinary and very magical and gave me everything that I had wanted and more. It exceeded expectations, and we were pretty much on our own to watch it. There were maybe like 10 other people we saw that morning. We were on top of a hill next to a gorge. If we had gone about 20 kilometres further south, we would have gotten an extra 10 seconds or so of complete darkness, but we would have been surrounded by several hundred other people. And we'd scoped out this spot a few days earlier and got up at 4:30 in the morning to make sure we were at the gates of the national park when they opened. And we're up there for about 2 hours before we saw another soul. And then the closest people to us for the actual event were a good 50 metres away, and there were maybe 8 or 10 other people within 10 kilometres. And it was extraordinary and beautiful and spooky and everything I wanted. And very profound, and kind of triggered a lot of quite amazing magical tributaries that are sort of continuing to flow through my life to this day. And so following that experience, I created this body of work looking at eclipses, and they culminated in a solo show last year in Perth as part of the Perth Festival at Holmes Court Gallery, which was the most elaborate and complicated project that I've done, because Holmes Court Gallery is this huge warehouse with a sawtooth roof with probably about 250 metres of windows, and I needed a space where I could control the lighting, so had to black out the entire space. It's an unair conditioned gallery as well, and all of the install period was during a really fierce heat wave of consecutive 40, 42 degree days, and I was 8 metres in the air with my install assistant on a scissor lift. The show itself was, again, very elaborate. I commissioned a musical work from an ensemble, a classical ensemble called Ad Lib Collective, and I wrote a script of my experience of the Exmouth eclipse, kind of saying, like, 11:20 a.m, quite dark now, the shadows have all disappeared. 11:22, all the night birds have started singing in the gorge. 11:36, the wind has come back, because the wind died down during the eclipse, but it happened so slowly that we didn't actually realise. And then it all came back suddenly in a rush a couple of minutes after the sky started getting brighter again. So the ensemble took this script and created a 40-minute long piece of music, interpreting it. And then we added 10 minutes of ambient drone on either side, so it went for an hour. And I worked with a lighting designer, and so the lighting in the gallery over the course of an hour got dimmer and dimmer and dimmer until the music reached its climax halfway through, which was the minute of totality. And then the lighting started to get brighter again, mimicking the actual timing of the eclipse itself. And then there was a performance work a week before the opening, where I sort of staged this magical ritual with actors interpreting, sort of manifesting the 7 planets of traditional astrology. And it was referencing Mesopotamian eclipse law. So 2,000 or 3,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, because again, all of the show was about the way that through multiple societies over the course of recorded human history, eclipses have been seen as a portent of something terrible happening. In Mesopotamia, during an eclipse, they would choose a commoner and crown them king or emperor or whatever their political system was. So that a commoner would become monarch for the length of the eclipse, so any ill luck that would fall on the royal household during that period would fall on them. But then once the eclipse was finished, just to make sure that the actual monarch was safe, they would execute the commoner. So that the ritual we staged, we had someone planted in the audience, but obviously the audience didn't know it was an actor, and the actors playing Saturn and Mars went through the crowd and selected him and brought him on the stage, and he was crowned and all the planets kneeled to him, and then he was dragged off to be executed. And the music played live, and then that was filmed and became one of the video works in the show and was timed with the lighting. And there were various other, a series of other works kind of exploring eclipse stories and mythology from various cultures. So these drawings were created for that show, but they weren't actually exhibited as part of it. They were reproduced on a big banner, which is one of my favourite artworks I've ever created, this 4.5 metre tall silk banner that it sort of started at the top as a yellow background and sort of ombreed into kind of this sort of orange and had this drawing on it. And as people entered the gallery, that was the first work they saw. because I wanted people as they set foot in the door to have this kind of moralistic reminder of kind of original sin and whatever disaster that eclipse was foretelling. I wanted people to sort of be confronted from the outset with this idea that, you know, maybe it was their fault. So it's nice to actually be able to show the drawings themselves in this context. What else do I have to say about it? Yeah, it's nice to re-show these drawings. I really like what my framer did with them, having them floating on the black, I think is really beautiful. And I did toy with the idea of having the angel in a white frame with a black mount and the banished Adam and Eve in a black frame with a white mount. But I think it's quite beautiful the way they sort of hover in space. And again, delightful to have them as part of the Dobell Prize and see them alongside such a diversity of other drawings. I think that's probably all I need to say about these, but yeah, delightful to have them in Sydney, and thanks for listening.